Dear church, let's continue our series, 10 Questions for 10 Preachers with Wesley Walker. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. Excited to have our guest today, Wesley Walker, with us. Wesley, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, absolutely. Enjoy the opportunity to have this chance to talk with you all and to be a part of the podcast. I appreciate the invite today.
Absolutely. Wesley, we have been friends from afar for a while now. We've never actually sat down and had a cup of coffee together or anything. I'm hoping to change that now that I'm in your area, but I've always enjoyed everything that you've put out there. I've gotten to listen to you and hear you speak, and I'm just really excited that you would take the time to join us today. Before we jump into our questions, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how your family's doing, how the work is going?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm married, have 3 kids, 11, 8, and 6. We are normally at a ball field or a basketball court or somewhere during our free time with their activities. So we're very blessed to have 3 healthy kids who are doing very well. I've been at Woodson Chapel Church of Christ here in Nashville for 13 years. Moved out from California 13 years ago. Chris moved to Middle Tennessee, but the joke in Middle Tennessee is basically everybody moves out from California. But I got that trend set a long time ago, although I am a West Tennessean by birth, so I can claim that in that way. But we've been here for 13 years. I really enjoy the area, enjoy the work we have at Woodson Chapel, the friendships and camaraderie that we have there. So my wife Amanda works in the local school district, so we're pretty involved here in the community, and we think that's a benefit to the work that we're doing. Chris, we might get into this later on, but I'm somewhat unique. For the first I've been in ministry for 17 years. The first 13 I was preaching, that was it. Last 4 or 5, I have a son who has a bit of special health needs. Went to our elders and decided I needed to look for a spot that had better insurance. Our congregation is a large enough congregation to offer insurance. It's just we have 5 people on staff and you offer insurance, and one of those people has a child whose medication is $40,000, $50,000 a month. It can sway that everybody else's premium. So I decided and feel comfortable with that. I was more than willing just to step away from ministry, do something else with a different role. But the elders here were like, no, we want you to be preaching and we'll support you as you make this move. So I am bivocational, not out of necessity from the standpoint of the church can't afford a minister, but out of necessity for my life situation. I had some very supportive elders in a congregation that has been supportive of that move now. It's been going on 5 years now for us. So I might have some unique things, and when you ask some of these questions later on about how my work week works, it's a bit different than most folks, but we've been able to manage that and I think have a successful ministry at Woodson for the last decade and a half now.
Well, I'm so glad that those elders decided, that would be fine for you to do that, because we wouldn't want to lose you in ministry. And I know they don't want to lose you because you're doing such a great work there.
Yeah, I'm very blessed. I'm 22 years old that took a chance on a guy looking to move to Tennessee to go to Freed Hardeman for master's work. And then, 15 years later, we still have a fruitful relationship there. So
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about the story. I mean, you mentioned it just a moment ago, but a little bit about the story of how you got into preaching, how you came about ministry. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So, my dad became a Christian a bit later in life. I was 9 or 10 years old when we first started going to church. My mom took us first. My mom grew up going to church, stopped, decided one day she would want to get her 3 boys into church. Maybe we were that bad. It was time to figure out something else. She took us to church, small country church up in West Tennessee. And then my dad, about a year into that, was, more or less, he didn't really go anywhere, but he wanted to argue with my mom about religion. And they had these conversations, some arguments. Eventually we led to Bible studies, and my dad became a Christian. Within a year, my dad wanted to preach, and that led us to Bear Valley. And I think first you have your dad, like you see what he did, so that was an influence. And then at Bear Valley, Bill Stewart, who passed away a couple of years ago, was the recruiter there. And at the age of 12, he sort of said, he had his fingers out counting the years between that moment when I graduated and had me in that class. And that's how it kind of worked out that once that came around, I looked at going pre-law or preaching and had some sort of like moments of prayer and some reading of scripture, and just decided I felt preaching was the what I should be doing. And so influence of my dad, Bill Stewart, early ministry influences are what kind of led me to take that same path there.
Yeah, that was my second question. Is kind of who inspired you? Your dad, Mr. Stewart.
Yeah.
Anybody else along the way that led you down that road?
Yeah, it's interesting. You think about your life in segments, and there's different folks who sort of show up, and maybe that's providential or however it works out, but folks show up. So my first influence in life was Miss Peggy Smith, who's been passed for years now. She was the Bible school teacher at the small country church my dad was converted at. About 35 of us. She taught anybody who didn't want to sit in the adult class, basically. So you'd have all the people down the list. And as somebody who had not grown up in church, at 9 or 10, she's teaching stories I'd never heard. And so she was the first one to sort of give me that encouragement. And then Mike Ray, who was our preacher there at that church, encouraged on Wednesday night for the different boys, which would be two of us, to speak. And I preached my first sermon at 9 because of his encouragement.
Wow.
I went to Bear Valley, and Byron Benitez and Hawatha Jones were close family friends of mine. Byron was my youth minister. Hy became still is a close family friend. Both of them are. And we traveled actually to Western Europe together to do mission work. I work with teenagers. They gave me responsibilities in those areas. They've been an influence through the years. And then once I started at Bear Valley, I had some close friends of mine who I think have really just encouraged me throughout my ministry there. So I think kind of each step of the way, you have these folks that influence you. So Bear Valley instructors, Freed Hardeman instructors, just the right people at the right time to kind of move your path forward is what I've been blessed with throughout my time in ministry. So even before that. So I think it kind of depends on the year on who was the biggest influence, but really, I've had some great people put in my life through the years. With all of that, last 17 has been my wife, just sort of there along the way, being willing to move cross country, to handle stuff that preachers' wives have to handle that some folks don't see behind the scenes and do so gracefully. She's kept me motivated and ready to go as well.
Oh, that's awesome. I can attest to the wife factor.
Yes,
my wife has been a huge factor in me just becoming a Christian, but also being a preacher. Let's shift gears a minute. Wesley, What would you say, in your own words, your own opinion, what would you say is the most important attribute for a preacher to have?
It's funny, this has changed. Early on, I was very much, when I went, and the preachers that I admired were the guys who could speak well. Those are the guys, you sit up there and as a young preacher, like, I hope one day I can deliver a message the way they do. As I've matured in my faith and as I've gotten to know folks, to me, I think the thing that comes back to is faithfulness, both in those I admire and in my own life. I want to make sure in my own life I'm faithful. I'm faithful to the commitments I've made to God, to my wife, to my family, that my character matches my message. And then I'm also faithful to the message that I preach, that I'm ensuring that with integrity I go into the pulpit or into conversations, and I'm, from the best of my ability, making sure that the message is, what's from God and making proper application, not going too far, not going far enough, just making sure it's there. So to me, I think faithfulness has become kind of the measurement of how I want to see things. I want to be the best communicator I can be. I still listen to great communicators. But also you see those men who are involved in ministry and in my own life, just somebody who's faithful to God and his message. And that's where I think the attributes that I point to that I think is most important right now. That seems to be true with what Paul tells Timothy and Titus, is that character, it matters a lot more than modern society puts on it, is the character of the individual. So that's where I think I'd probably land on right now.
Yeah, totally agree. I think you get that right, you get everything right.
Yep. Me
so
too.
So let me ask you this. What has been the biggest challenge in your life as a minister?
Yeah. So I think there's two things. I would say the first 10 years, 10 or 12 years, the challenge is always people. And I say that not in the sense of it's a bad thing, but people are people, and you've got the ups and downs and how you're handling everything from their difficulties, the times in which they're hard to love, the times in which loving them is hard because you care for them so much and you see tragedy in their life or decision makings that they make that's there. So I think managing people is a skill that's hard for ministers, especially a lot of us grew up in sort of the learn the text, know the text, preach the text, but it's like, that's great, but it's not just an academic exercise and, can you figure out this word, that word, and how it fits, but how do you communicate that to people? And then how do you get in the lives of the congregation that you're dealing with in a meaningful way? So I think, obviously for anybody, that the biggest issue from preachers is people. In a moment, I think we talk about the biggest blessing. I think the same thing. It's people, but you've got those managing of people and being able to handle those. That's the first half. The last 4 or 5 years is time management. That's just something that you're constantly being pulled. For me, I'm in leadership at a healthcare tech organization. So there's meetings on the books, there's things going on, there's travel. So there's that part of it, and then there's the stuff you want to do in terms of preaching and teaching. Now at Woodson, we've hired some folks to help me with kind of the day-to-day, what used to be visitation stuff. We hired an older gentleman who's very who knew the congregation well to sort of take that over to help that stuff, but you're still trying to figure out, how do you manage time, and then add in a wife and 3 kids. And so that to me is always the challenge of life, of balancing out, what gets the most of your time and when. So that was more of to me, that's more of the biggest challenge I face now, is how to balance out the time that I have in the most effective way.
Yeah. Well, you already alluded to it, but let's reverse that. What do you think is the biggest blessing in ministry?
I think it's the same thing as the biggest is it's people. To me, you get into ministry, you should at least, because you believe that what you do matters in the lives of individuals. And although when you preach week in and week out, you don't always see that immediately. You don't always get that instant. But over a period of time, you get to see life change. You get to see folks who become Christians because of your influence and your preaching. You get to see individuals who are more patient, who are kinder than they were before, who are able to relate to their spouse better, who are becoming evangelistic. And you see that not in a sermon and then the next day they're doing that, but over a period of cultivating that relationship and those preaching, those teaching moments. Those life changes are amazing to see. And then the fact that you just have the support of a congregation. When my youngest son Emmett was born, he had some health issues, and we just had a church family that said, we're here, and food was brought every day, and kids were watched, and it was just one of these things where you could just see what the family of God can do when they're rallying around a certain thing. So I think the people are the biggest blessing that comes along with ministry there.
Yeah, no doubt. Some of the best people I've ever known have been in the church, and what a blessing that is. So you've already mentioned that your work week is not typical, and walk us through your work week now that you're bivocational. Walk us through that.
Yes, I always joke, typical isn't typical, so I don't really have a typical week. So,
Right.
So being in leadership at the job that I'm in, I've got certain meetings I have to be at. So you've got meetings of those that I manage to make sure they're doing the right stuff. So those are set in calendar. I've got meetings with my boss and a board that have to make sure those things are set at a certain time. And then travel is normally a part of the schedule there. So those are kind of the blocks that are built. And then I'm in sales, so you've got kind of the conversations with different health systems. That's where I work specifically that you're working through. So you got those blocked off, and so I kind of get in on Sunday night, see the week ahead, see what gaps I might have in terms of time, and then use those most effectively for sermon prep, for Bible class, evenings and stuff for visitation and those sort of things. I do sermons on flights quite a bit. I have a lot of longer flights, and so I'll jump up and I'll use that time to do sermons and Bible classes and get ahead. Or there's nights where I'm in a hotel room, my wife's life gets more chaotic when I'm gone because she's got to manage 3 kids. My life simplifies in that hotel room. I can just sit there and I can focus in on some time of study there. So that's actually kind of a benefit once the work day is done at conferences or with regards to those things. It sort of helps out in those ways. So I try to just manage the time where I have it. I like my sermons done early enough in the week or even a week ahead if I can be, that I'm able to then sort of polish those off more towards that week of actually preaching and preparation. But that's what I normally do. Now, I always joke, PowerPoints are always Saturday. Like, it doesn't matter. If I could wrote the sermon 3 years ago, PowerPoint's still Saturday because I have to have that freedom to be able to change things up. So our IT guy always jokes. He's like, I don't expect anything from Saturday afternoon. I said, it can be done a month ago, but I got to have that time at the very end after the week just to make sure everything still flows in my mind before that Sunday time of preaching and teaching. So.
Yeah. So how often are you traveling, and how many days a week are you gone?
Yeah. So December and January were great. There was very little, but normally I'm on the road on a flight somewhere 2 to 3 times a month for 2 or 3 days at a time is normally where it is. So that's kind of my travel schedule on the road there. So I take a lot of weird flights. I'll take red-eye backs to get to Saturday morning basketball games for kids, or if I'm, I coach a couple of kids teams, so I'll take the the flights nobody wants to get in and out to see their stuff. But using the airport, my office is at home or at the airport at this point. What I do. So yeah.
That's crazy. So, talk a little bit about sermon preparation. Yours is going to be very different than a lot of people. So, what's that process look like for you?
Yeah, so I guess I'll step back from a larger standpoint. I have two types of sermons. I have scheduled sermons to where I think this is what I want to cover this year, and I might even block those off in terms of this month, this month, this month. So that starts with a schedule. Like what I want to cover, and what does it look like? What's the topic? And then topic leads me to text. Okay, what text? At this point in my ministry, you're preaching long enough, you study the Bible long enough, you kind of know which text lend to which topics. You're not forcing things. So which text or which book of the Bible or which 3 chapters in a book of the Bible address this topic that we can cover in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So that's kind of wrestling with the text again, getting in there, trying to see exactly what the nuance is. How do we figure it out from here? Then illustrations. Okay, how do we illustrate what the text says? And then application in terms of sermon prep. That's the big picture. Actually doing that, I normally, I try to make sure I have one big point. So what's the big idea I'm trying to get across? And then vary the approach in terms of how do I best get that across in this particular context. So it can be deductive, inductive. It can be the we, me, we sort of. It's just one of those things where you kind of look through it at that point and think through. But I try to begin with, on the schedule side of things, what do I think the congregation needs in general? That's just in general, we have these. And what does that look like in terms of scheduling that out? So that's kind of one track of sermons there. The other is kind of need-based sermons. I'm all for scheduling out sermons, but I also think there's times for preachers to step back and say, hey, I've got to address this. And so I always have flexibility to I'll stop it. I don't have no problem stopping a series or postponing a series to say, hey, this has come up and I want to spend the next couple of weeks talking about this. So need-based obviously start different. The need or application is first. Like you already had that. I want this point to be made with this sermon or this series. It's the application that I want. Then you go into the text, then you go to illustration. So it kind of reverses the whole thing to where before it might be more, scheduling these things out and working your way to what's the best application of this text and this idea. So now you kind of know the application you're trying to build from the other side. So I try to do a varied approach. I do have scheduled sermons, and it's amazing to me how often a scheduled plan and a topic for that week matches the need of that week. As Paul says, perhaps this is providential in some way, or perhaps God does that on his end. But I try to do both of those in my tracks there. In terms of preparation of the actual sermon itself, I try to stick in the text first. So I want to make sure I'm honest with the text there. My background is biblical languages, so if I can, I'll have the Greek and Hebrew as much as I can, sort of working through that. And see if there's any nuance there, anything that I think can be brought out from that. But just sort of slowing it down. To me, original language stuff is not so much for the pulpit as it just makes me slow down my reading. So I'm having to stop and think through it and sort of slow down those things. Similar to what somebody might do if they have different Bible versions. You read 4 or 5 different versions, it makes you slow down and think about, why is this translation doing this versus that? So that's kind of where I start that preparation. And then, from there, what's the key point of the text and how do I build that argument and to make a persuasive case at the end there?
Yeah, that's really, I'm sure, not an easy task week to week with your schedule, but sounds like you get it all done. And I assume you're working ahead to some degree?
When I can, I am. When I'm trying to, I do. So I had a series on Malachi that I preached in January, because Malachi really pushes this idea of giving God your best. A great time in January to reflect on that. That's one back in July that I knew was coming. So it's one of those where you might not be in sermon prep, but you're in constant prep of kind of walking through. Let's get back. Let's read the text. Let's kind of have this here. Let's have some outlines. And so you have those as well. I had an instructor named Warren Wilcox, who talked about the homiletic habit. And his view was you should always have a notepad out and just sort of when you see something, just write it down, write the idea, and just sort of have this mentality. So I think most preachers have that. Something will pop up, something will happen, and that'll be the seed. And you just write that down, and all of a sudden that becomes either a whole sermon, an illustration in a sermon. It becomes something that sort of, is there for you. So that's been helpful to me as well, just writing down some observations that I think can be used later in sermon prep or within the process there. So, people always ask how long does a sermon take to write? And it's like, well, it depends. Sometimes you can write it quickly, but you're really putting your entire life experience and all your studying previous and stuff like that. It's hard to it's not like you're going to Matthew chapter 5 for the first time in your life this week to figure out what it says. You've spent time and effort and energy in Matthew and the chapter and those sort of things. So, time-wise, I always joke
Sure.
it's a lifetime there because you got it all built in there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So do you practice beforehand? I mean, with your schedule the way it is, how do you get it from page to the pulpit?
Yeah, it's funny to me. And it's through my ministry time, it's been when I was in the office, I did the pulpit. I'd go to the pulpit and actually preach, and the secretary would laugh. She heard the sermon more than once every week because I would
Right.
get up there and do it that way. I kind of moved with the car of my family. They got to hear the sermon sometimes, those times. Now, you can be in a hotel room. I don't normally preach the whole thing anymore. So I don't, being extemporaneous, not in the sense of like I get to know what I'm saying, but more of, I don't know if I want to be that polished to where I'm going through it and it's like almost robotic. So I try to vary that. But if I know there's a section where I want to make sure I get not just the point, but the emotion, everything behind it, I will go through like a section. So I'm more of, as I'm writing it, as I'm going through it, I'm writing to preach. So I'm preaching that and I'm going through it. So I might have a time where I sit down and say, here's 30 minutes where I'm just going to sit and preach it. But there's nothing that I'm going through where I'm not preaching that text, where it's like, how does this going to sound from the preaching experience? So I think it's a little bit different now with some more experience in those things of just as you're preparing it, at least for me, I'm preaching it. Okay, how's this going to sound? How does that work? Is it going to flow? Is point one going to go into point two? If you have a point sort of thing, like what does that look like there? So I guess in my view now, it's more of, I'm preaching it section by section as I'm writing it and flowing it that way.
Yeah. Well, so Wesley, you talked about this a little bit already. Well, actually, more than a little bit. But let me ask it again. So, balance. What is balance for you? How are you trying to achieve balance with all the things that you've got going on? You said you take a red eye sometimes to get home so you can make basketball games and things like that. That's got to be a huge challenge. You've already mentioned that. So, how do you make all those plates spin?
Yeah, I think I don't know if I do it well. I always tell people it's like you do what you have to do. So kind of give my background. I grew up the first 10, 11 years of my life on a farm. And in farm life, it doesn't matter what you have going on. There are certain things that have to be done.
Yeah.
So I grew up with that mentality. You just do what you have to do. Your life is what it is, and you figure it out as you go along. So I'm probably not as, thoughtful or philosophical on balance. I'm just more of there's tasks to be done and you want to make sure you do them. So I make sure my priorities are set. So I want to make sure that I'm not taking away from my kids and my family as much as I can. So I make sure that's set. I have a very supportive church and elder team. If something comes up to where there's a church event that I'm not leading, or it's like, preachers go to all kinds of different events. Sometimes it just makes sense for me not to go if the kids have something. And so they're very supportive of that, making sure that the family is a part of that. But also I do take early morning flights and late flights. I drive the kids to school most mornings, so I block out that time to kind of help get them ready and drive them in. So you have, those things. So I'm not perfect at it, but I just have the mindset I'm going to get the stuff done. So if that means late nights or early mornings, then I'll do late nights and early mornings. So that's sort of my mentality there. I wish I had a great answer for how to balance. I think most people do. Most people just don't. We all know we should balance well, but most of us, I don't think, have answers. We just sort of like, you just got to prioritize things, set certain blocks, and this has to be done. And then you kind of learn what doesn't have to be done. But also I think for most preachers I've taught with, it's managing guilt. And what I mean by that is at times we feel guilty if you're not involved with everything that's going on. You can feel guilty for spending time with your family. So I've always just encouraged preachers like, look, I get it. So-and-so's second cousin is having a basketball game 3 towns over, and they've asked you to go to it. Don't skip your son's kindergarten graduation to go to that. Don't let that guilt lead you to that sort of thing. So being able to manage guilt is, I think, something preachers struggle with, because we want to make everybody happy, and we assume we have to make all 300 people, 500 people, whatever size congregation you're at happy. And it can be, you can drive yourself crazy because you make decisions not based off of what's most important, but based off of guilt. So I'm always sort of talking to myself like, look, you're not doing anything wrong by saying no to certain things.
Exactly.
So
I
that's
totally agree. So I've jumped back into coaching. I'm assisting the baseball team here,
oh,
the
great.
high school team here at Dixon County, and our head coach Rodney Parker is a dynamo. He's the Energizer Bunny, And I don't have kids at home anymore. Mine are grown, but we have a couple of guys on staff who still have children. That one of them is playing college ball, and the others are still in high school. And he's told them, if you come to practice or to a game and skip your kid's game, you're fired. And I love that mentality. He said,
I
I'll
do
fire
too.
you. He said, I'll fire you if you come to this over your kid's stuff. And I think that's great. And I think what you said is absolutely true, is don't sacrifice family time for those kind of things. So this may go along with what you just said, but what is the best piece of advice that you could give to a young preacher starting out, or maybe even, somebody who's been doing it a while?
Yes, I think that last point of managing your own guilt is always important. I think that's, and that can be everything from your feelings of inadequacy as a minister, or as, the things you struggle with from a temptation standpoint, to even, how, saying yes or no to certain things. But tied to that, I would say just spend time cultivating integrity. That's to me, I think, is important.
Yeah.
I've got great friends who, some have stayed faithful to God throughout their ministry experience, and some have left God during their time in ministry. And I think they've been very talented in what they do, but the integrity wasn't cultivated in a way to keep them sustainable in their faith. And that to me is a tragic thing. So kind of as Paul says, that don't disqualify yourself in the part of this. So cultivating that integrity, making sure you have folks that keep you accountable outside of your immediate church, whether that's other preachers, that's someone else, is making sure those things, because I think we want to be in ministry for the long haul. And so being able to have that mindset, I think, is important. Any profession has folks who fail, and fail publicly in serious ways. But I'd like to see fewer ministers do it. And I think if we emphasize this idea of integrity and faithfulness and seeing those things, that's important in that way. So I think, to me, it's more of a character thing. You should get better at your craft. We all have a thing we do. We're both sports guys. I've got 3 kids that play. My oldest daughter's a softball pitcher. She's super competitive. She's out there in the garage. She's at a preaching practice. She's putting in the work to get better at her craft. And I think we should have that same effort in our preaching and teaching. Yeah. We should try to get better. But as I tell my daughters and my son, I want you to do all sorts of things, but who you are matters more than that. So Absolutely. It's who you are that counts. So do the best you can. Anything you're doing, you do the best you can. That's our expectation. Your mom and dad have. We want you to do the best you can, but we want you to make sure you don't forget who you are no matter what you're doing. So I think even in ministry, we should want to be the best we can be in preaching and teaching and other parts of the ministry that we're doing. But ultimately, we want to make sure we are the people that match that as best as we can as well. So I think that's my challenge to young, old, whatever other category or preacher you put us in. Let's focus on being the men and women of men of God first, and then go from there. So.
No doubt. Great advice. Thank you, Wesley. And thank you so much for joining us. Before we let you go, we like to highlight the good on here. So tell us about anything you want to plug, anything that you've got going. Let us know how we can keep up with you, any of that.
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those fun spots there. I preach at What's in Chapel. You can listen to sermons there. So my email is preacherwesley@gmail.com. So if I can ever help anybody in that way, I'd love to. I got nothing to plug. I'm here to help folks. I get preachers who talk to me about things like bivocational. I get folks that have questions about what does that look like, and so I'm here to help in any of those challenges you might find in that way. But so that's where you can reach me, and I appreciate the time today.
Yeah. And along those same lines, if any of our viewers and listeners have a question about today's episode, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question for Wesley, we'll make sure that it gets forwarded to him, and I'm sure he'd be glad to answer that. Of course, you gave your email just then too, preacherwesley@gmail.com, so you can email him directly as well. Wesley, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you, and blessings to you and all that you're doing.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.